So I'm a historian of science, and I will tell you the history of the strobe light, and I got interested in the strobe light. I just published a book on the history of a tenth of a second, and it's right there, the book, and it mainly deals with the 19th century. So I was very tired of the 19th century, very tired of the tenth of a second, and decided to go into a 20th century topic and explore really what happened to philosophy and to science once the time became partitioned in much smaller units than in the 19th century. So this is one of the papers that grew out of that curiosity. Okay, so I'll start by saying that most histories of the strobe, they focus exclusively on the work of Harold Edgerton. He was a professor at MIT, and he was famous for photographs of bullets in midair and half-exploding balloons. I'll show some of the famous images that I'm sure a lot of you have seen. This is another one. Famous. The birth of the stroboscope is usually traced back to more than 100 years before Edgerton started working on the strobe light, to 1832, when slotted discs turning at high speeds were developed to provide a viewer with an illusion of movement. The scientist Joseph Plateau was credited with the invention. He called it a phenakistoscope. And Simon Stamford was responsible for coining the term stroboscope a few months after Plateau's publications. By the 1920s, electronic stroboscopes, and this is a big difference between the stroboscopes that are just spinning discs and the electronic ones with a flash. They were already commercially available for industrial use. And in 1942, the ability, and I'll quote, to halt with a stroboscope and camera a bullet in flight was hailed as one of the most important achievements of civilization, equal to the development of the telescope and the microscope. So James Killian was a young science writer who would become one of the most important science policy advisors of all times. He was president of MIT and later one of Eisenhower's trusted scientific advisors during the years of Sputnik. And he started his career by writing about Edgerton's photographs. And I'll show a few more of these. There's one with hitting a golf ball. And this one is a neutrino in one of the particle colliders, so it's not well known as a strobe photo, but it's very well known as a scientific photo, forgotten that it's a strobe. And Killian started writing, and it's amazing to have this very important science policy person start his career by writing about the photographs of Edgerton. For half a century, Killian played the role of Cyrano de Bergerac, elegantly writing about the photographs while Doc Edgerton stayed at a distance. He described Edgerton's images as, quote, literal transcriptions of nature, and, quote, a unique and literal transcript of that time world beyond the threshold of our eyes. He said they were scientific records that were written in, quote, a universal language for all to appreciate. And very few people doubted this naive realist interpretation. Gaston Bachelard was an exception, who in 1936 cautioned that, quote, philosophers should reflect on the ease of correspondence between the real phenomena and the instrumental phenomena of stroboscopy. So from 1939 to 1954, Killian and Edgerton published their famous book. And during these years, many things had changed. Edgerton went on active duty during World War II, and his night reconnaissance work won him the Medal of Freedom. His two associates followed similar paths. One of them went to the Rad Lab at MIT, and the other one went to work at the Manhattan Project. And in 1947, they founded a successful and very lucrative business, defense contract business, that today is called Perkin-Elmer. And Edgerton and his partners made a lot of money from military contract work. And one of the tasks of their shop involved photographing nuclear explosions. They developed a rapatronic camera. They called it rapid and electronic. They put the two words together. And they took these photographs, which are atomic bombs at the beginning of exploding. And this is the Robotronic camera. And in the years after the war, some of these photographs became declassified. And in 1949, the famous photographer Edward Steichen organized at the Museum of Modern Art an exhibition called The Exact Instant. And he included a 30 feet wide by 14 feet mural of Edgerton's A-bomb photos. So there were two editions of his book. The 1954 edition of the book had 25 new images, and I find this image absolutely incredible because they kept the preface the same. So from 1939 to 1954, they didn't believe that anybody needed to think about the images in any different way. But I find it pretty obscene to have the 1939 edition being replaced by the golf ball being replaced by an A-bomb with no commentary whatsoever, just same book, apparently.
But is that even in the 15 years between those two editions, had the technology, had the possibilities of what you could do with this changed that dramatically? I mean, from recreational to...
Absolutely, yeah. So the first one's 1939 and the last one's 1954. But what's interesting for me is that there's no change in the commentary, right? They say that things are the same in the world. But a few scientists, however, started using strobes in a way that was completely at odds with these common uses and common photographs. These alternative experiments drew from a different tradition, that of investigating the effects of light on humans. And it is within this tradition that I would like to place the work that is being done here, not the other Edgerton tradition, which I think is much more boring, if I can say that. So such experiments contrasted sharply with Edgerton's. Edgerton sometimes aimed his machine at a person's eye to measure the time of a wink, and also to capture the delay in the iris's adjustment to light. But he always ignored the effects of the strobe on the brain, and he always ignored the experience of the experimental subject. He could not, however, prevent alternative uses of the technology. When he was not looking, some of his students at MIT stared directly into the machine. Edgerton never condoned these practices. And I've talked to people that Edgerton was very happy because he went to the laboratory at MIT where they loaned the stroboscopes, and he saw that students were checking them out during the weekend, and he thought that they were all doing these photographs of bullets, and they were really sort of using it to look into it, and he was quite appalled of those uses. So for a few years in the 1950s, a few scientists instead used it not to illuminate the phenomena under investigation, but to see visions from the strobe with their eyes only a few centimeters from the light source. For 2 years, from 1957 to 1958, they systematically recorded their visions. So visions of this sort could appear without complicated machines. Where did they come from? Why were they so, quote, extraordinarily vivid? Why did they sometimes appear coupled with a strong emotive sense of eeriness? Why were they frequently described as deep? And why did they often appear to be under clear, rippling water? When were they first seen, and when were they first described? How did they change scientists' view of what it meant to observe? So in 1823 is the first account by the physiologist Jan Purkinje of what later came to be called flicker effects. And he saw these simply by waving his fingers in front of one eye while staring at the sun. And he drew the patterns that he saw. And I'll go into this image. I'll say a little bit. What it was used to justify using the strobe for high-speed photographs like Edgerton's, because if you see here, the baseball is hitting the bat where the shadow hasn't hit it yet. So this is taken with a normal shutter camera mechanism, and it tells you that it's just not proper for capturing the instant. And these are the images drawn by Perkinian. It's the first 4 images, and it's the first account of these flicker visions. A decade later, another scientist, David Brewster, noted that these effects sometimes appeared when walking beside a high iron railing, and what he saw, quote, exceeded any optical phenomena which I have witnessed. The visions were so dazzling that the eye is soon obliged to withdraw itself from its overpowering influence, and he prudently turned the other way. In The Living Brain, a book published in 1953 by the controversial neurophysiologist William Gray Walter, he suggested that intermittent flashes could appear spontaneously in the rainforest as light passed through tree leaves. He hypothesized that they could have caused important evolutionary developments, being perhaps the force that knocked down an ape from a tree to the ground, providing the first essential impetus for its transition to Homo erectus. Flicker, Walter argued, was the reason why we emerged as, quote, sadder but wiser apes. But despite the fact that many scientists claimed that these visions were ubiquitous and that they easily appeared in a number of everyday situations, they rarely described them and they rarely drew them. In an important 19th century book on optics by Hermann Helmholtz, he ventured only briefly into what he called this extremely perplexing region of the most manifold phenomena, and offered brief descriptions. He mentioned a water silk effect that appeared when looking at intermittent sources of light, a central rosette figure surrounded by dots increasing in size, quote, which may be possibly compared to a rose with many petals. But up to the middle of the 20th century, only a handful of other scientists besides Helmholtz had made brief references to these visions. Brewster, for example, maintained that observing them required courage and that drawing them was nearly impossible because of their rapidly changing nature. So why did scientists look away for so long, until the 1950s? Why did they so seldom describe their visions or represent them as drawings? Helmholtz claimed that the reason why, quote, most observers thus far have been able to establish only comparatively few facts and made a few new discoveries had to do with fatigue and safety. Precautions needed to be taken. These experiments required practice and self-sacrifices. And prohibitions against certain types of self-experimentation were already legendary in the scientists since the late 18th century. One extreme was a scientist called Johann Ritter, who stared at the sun for a record of 20 minutes. And for the next 26 days, he was unable to see black and white, seeing only reversed colors. Helmholtz at times praised these investigations, but he advised against them. The second reason why Helmholtz gave for ignoring them was that nobody knew how to explain them using existing theories. So in short, if unexplained, better ignored. When electronic stroboscopic technology started to appear in the first decades of the 20th century, a few more scientists started to note these effects. In 1934, the Cambridge physiologist Lord Adrian and his student, who would become known for measuring brain waves, investigating the effects of the strobe light on the brain. In an experiment considered foundational for electroencephalographic research, they stared into a 30-watt automobile lamp headlight bulb covered with a spinning disc that was powered by a gramophone motor. And their findings showed that by varying the flash frequency, they could change the frequency of the recorded brain waves. Adrian and Matthews reported that, quote, colored patterns may be observed by looking at the flickering lights and having, quote, an extremely unpleasant feeling during the experiment. But they did not describe these effects any further and instead tried hard to eliminate them. If their experiment was to work, these strange visions had to go. So in 1942, the noted scientist Heinrich Kluwer became interested in these visions, noticing a connection between them and what he saw while experimenting with mescal, or peyote. For decades, he had been self-experimenting with a drug, and he noticed a similarity between the visions of mescal and flicker. He used an alternating current of low intensity, and he tried the experiments on a student. So when the current was on, one subject suddenly saw the profiles of 5 faces looking to the right. These faces changed into other faces. They were seen through the muslin curtain of flicker, as the subject expressed it. So many writers, poets, and artists had described drug-induced states. Baudelaire, Le Paradis Artificial, Thomas de Quincey, Dreams of an Opium Eater. But few individuals had experimented with mezcal. There are a few artists that are exceptions, like Antonina Artaud's Les Tarahumaras of the 1940s and André Michaud, Miserable Miracle of the 1950s. So Kluver was one of the first scientists to venture into this area. William Gray Walter, the famous physiologist and cybernetician, continued to experiment with the strobe in the tradition inaugurated by the electroencephalographers. But his research started differing from previous investigations since he used a high-power stroboscope that was manufactured by Scophony, one of the first makers of television sets. The intensity was comparable to the light of 88,000 candles. In contrast to previous experimental setups, such as the automobile lamp with gramophone system, his flash lasted only 10 microseconds. So Walter and his co-authors found that the instrument could be used to invoke epileptic fits. And it was common knowledge since Roman times that seizures could be provoked in epileptics by exposing them to flickering light or to a potter's wheel. But what was impressive about Gray Walter's work was that it appeared in people that had no previous history of epilepsy. And even if these persons were under large doses of anticonvulsant drugs. So the theory of epilepsy changed from being understood as a condition that only a few individuals carried to one in which it was seen as latent in all individuals to differing degrees. Walter confirmed Adrian and Matthew's discovery that the flashes changed the electrical rhythm patterns emitted by the brain. And he speculated about ways in which they could be used to study and also adjust the out-of-step cerebral rhythms associated with seizures, cerebral tumors, lesions, and other pathologies. But like Adrian and Matthews before him, he focused most of his investigations on the EEG record, and I'll show you one of the images of the record, not on the visions themselves. So following Walter, neurophysiologists increasingly used electroencephalographic techniques in combination with the strobe stimulation, and this is what you're seeing over there with Ivana in the room. But they still kept ignoring the strobe visions. But in 1949, during a routine investigation of a patient that was suffering from extreme anxiety, the investigator working in South Africa mentioned them briefly. His patient suffered from, quote, vivid visual hallucinations, informing the experimenter that these hallucinations consisted, quote, primarily of things that happened during my life. So intrigued by the visual reconstructions from past experience that were probably released from some sort of storage mechanism, the experimenter ran more tests. In 1953, he experimented on approximately 1,000 subjects who were asked to stare into a Scophony strobe at a distance of 9 centimeters. And like Walter, he noted, quote, delusional or hallucinatory states directly evoked by flicker. But like the researchers before him, he was also mostly interested in the EEG record. He said, the very nature of these responses, combined with their infrequency, renders controlled study impossible. Angela Masuka Costa, a researcher who would become one of Italy's most important psychologists, took a different perspective. She experimented on 50 subjects and documented responses of a fantastical and hallucinatory nature, describing how subjects saw horses, sails, tears, eyes, spiders. She provided a few drawings. Image here. I don't think you can see too well. But he said that these visions have something similar to the artistic and speculated that they may have a projective and symbolic value. They showed, quote, an amazing liberty compared to that of artistic creativity. How could a machine, the strobe, induce this freedom? By the mid-1950s, most scientists considered strobe visions to be hallucinations, similar to those evoked not only by spinning discs and mezcal, but by other conditions, 3 Canadian researchers noticed that these visions could appear not only when the subject was overstimulated with a strobe light, but understimulated in a sensory deprivation chamber.
So would people have their eyes closed or open during these experiments?
Most of them were with the eyes closed, the ones that were using high-power stroboscope, but 9 centimeters, just like Ivan is doing it. But they tried everything, and they tried it in one eye and the other eye, and try to, So Richard Bloom, a scientist from Stanford University, explored the connection of strobe visions and schizophrenia. Bloom came from working with the US Army during the Korean War in a classified experimental unit designed to find ways to bring traumatized soldiers back into combat. He would become famous for later experiments on LSD. In 1954, his main concern was to see how the strobe affected healthy brain damage in schizophrenic individuals. Schizophrenics saw most of the meaningful images of a hallucinatory nature, such as fire, waves, crabs, umbrellas, subway tunnels, dandelions, genitalia, and others. And although the reactions of the patients were varied and sometimes severe, one of them went into a catatonic state that lasted for 3 days. His results centered on counting the amounts of imagery rather than on the content of the images themselves. But a few years later, from 1957 to 1958, the British neuroscientist John R. Smithies reached different conclusions by embarking on a detailed project to study what an observer experienced were looking directly into the strobe. Along with his students, staff, subjects, he stared at the strobe and recorded observations while changing the frequency and varying other conditions. The more Smithies worked with the stroboscope, the more complicated the patterns became. Some patterns seemed like pond life, bacteria, germs, plankton. Others were described as streets and houses swirling around. One person saw an aerial photo of a city with streets and blocks of houses. It is like looking at London from a tremendous height and seeing the whole lot swirling about. Another reported seeing lovely tropical fish in a blue tank. Many described wallpaper, and this was mostly Victorian, although one stood out as having a terrific modern design. Some subjects saw, quote, a continual stream of images of fully formed scenes, usually of commonplace objects and events, such as trains, cars, street scenes, harbors, animals, peoples. To one of them, they appeared, quote, like a number of scenes in a badly cut film. Nonetheless, certain patterns never appeared, like alphabetical symbols, enabling Smithies to classify them into 7 main types. So, for the first time, the stroboscopic patterns themselves proved valuable for research. And this is one from an image from Smithies. Smithies concluded that the effects of staring into a strobe light were similar to many others. Staring at rapidly spinning black and white disk when poking your eyes, hallucinations when entering into sleep or coming out of sleep, visualizations of entopic phenomena, which I think Olafour has done. In the visual phenomena of insulin hypoglycemia. And he also noted that when mescaline and the stroboscope were used together, hallucinogenic effects were enhanced. Both were also highly addictive. Smithies came to work on the stroboscope after studying the effects of mescaline with the controversial neurophysiologist Humphrey Osmond. With his co-author, they developed the first biochemical theory of schizophrenia by arguing that a defect in the metabolization of adrenaline could produce in the body a substance similar to mescaline that then created the effects of the disease. In doing research with mescaline and lysergic acid, which was a precursor to LSD, Smithies and Osmond found similarities between their effects, concluding that the mental disorder was a chemical disorder. And this is the first time that they discovered that or thought that. Smithies' research had wide repercussions. The famous psychologist Carl Jung became interested in his work, and he invited Smithies to his home, where they delighted in some Freud bashing. Smithies reported that Jung was intrigued by his assertion that mescaline visions have, quote, nothing to do with the personality having them, and that he saw his work with Osmond as a corroboration of the theories of the collective unconscious. The writer Aldous Huxley read a paper by Smithies on mescaline and wrote to him saying that he very much wanted to try the drug. While Smithies could not personally deliver the drug to Huxley, he put him in contact with Osmond, who gave him his first dose while on a trip to California in the spring of 1953. So what intrigued Huxley was the same claim that interested Jung, that these experiences were not created by the person undergoing them, but rather that they came from elsewhere. Huxley next experimented with the strobe, and he said, "To sit with the eyes closed in front of stroboscopic lamp is a very curious and fascinating experience." According to Smithies, the direction of the research changed when the colleagues unfortunately recruited Harvard professor Timothy Leary. Leary's interest in drugs was also accompanied by an interest in strobe research. In his famous publication, How to Change Behavior, he wrote that about photostimulation as a means of consciousness alteration. Concentrated attention to a stroboscope or flicker apparatus can produce visionary experiences. So strobe research continued, often in combination with new drugs. In 1959, at the Mental Research Institute of Palo Alto, the beat poet Allen Ginsberg was given LSD, and his reaction to the drug was investigated using a stroboscope and an EEG machine. The Veterans Administration Hospital in Palo Alto, where Bloom had set up his strobe research a few years before, became the site of state-sponsored, government-sponsored research on the drug. Another subject was Ken Casey. He volunteered to try numerous drugs there and later recounted his experiences in the famous novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the movie by Jack Nicholson, The Shining, is based on this novel. Experimenters could not keep their research completely in-house. Casey started using LSD and the strobe in a different way, organizing the first acid drug parties illuminated by the strobe light. By the end of the 60s, the strobe had become essential paraphernalia of the drug revolution. It had traveled quickly from laboratories to hospitals, to artist studios, drug dens, and finally to discos. So the boyfriend of the controversial beat poet William S. Burroughs soon constructed a simple flicker machine, and this is what we've seen, known as the Dream Machine, with the purpose of democratizing self-experimentation with flicker. By the mid-60s, Burroughs was advertising flicker as a way to, quote, to achieve the same results as taking drugs by non-chemical means. He described using, quote, flicker, music through headphones, cut-ups and fold-ins to produce his novels, and he illustrated the technique in his films. So the optic of strobe experimentation hurt Smithies' career. He believed that the tasks of, quote, artist and science overlapped, explaining that, quote, both have always been interested in exploring the transcendental worlds that the expansion of normal consciousness leads to, but few agreed. So strobe effects and visions were part and parcel of a burgeoning postmodern era. Artificial light became stroboscopic when Westinghouse alternating current method won over Edison's direct current as a public utility. So a result in America, light alternates 50 times per second, and in Europe, 60 times per second, and in Europe 50 times. When the frequency of alternation became steadier in most households during the 1920s, everyday artificially illuminated life started to beat with a regular pulsating stroboscopic rhythm. By the post-war era, artificial light was only one component of a mass of other pulsating light sources. A leading pediatrician of the time remarked how stroboscopic effects were all-pervasive by the early 60s. He said, modern developments have increased the forms of flicker to which the seizure-prone person is subjected: fluorescent lighting, neon signs, motion pictures, and television. It was urgent to study the potential dangers lurking behind what he called the complexities of modern life and its attendant new forms of light reflection, particularly those of television. So these reactions to strobe, comparisons between strobe and television are quite important. And they led Smithies to build on a hypothesis, first volunteered by William Gray Walter, where he ventured that visual perception functioned like a television. So reversing a centuries-old comparison of vision with a camera, Walter concluded that the visual system in the brain did not work like a camera at all. And the reason for this was that scientists could not produce hallucinatory effects with a strobe light and a cinematographic camera. but these effects appeared rapidly if the strobe was used in combination with television. So, for example, if you if you take a strobe into a film studio and you take it into a television studio, you have two completely different effects. In a film studio, if the frequency coincides, the frequency between the frames, nothing happens. If it coincides with the frames, then you have no film at all. In the television studio, on the contrary, if you're show a strobe light and try to film it with a television camera, you have dots and dashes appear across the screen, and it just goes completely crazy. So because they saw signs of hallucinatory effects in a television studio, like they did when the subject was exposed to the strobe light, they thought that it was a better analogy than the camera for vision. So the change in analogizing the visual mechanism in the brain as televisual instead of cinematographic brought important changes in philosophy. So just as a television set does not give us a direct view of the events televised, the televisual system in the brain also did not provide a direct view of reality. The naive realist view that Smithies forcefully criticized informed common interpretations of what it meant to observe. Smithies did not believe that observations were ever that simple. So Walter's work, especially that which was aimed at a general readership, asked how modern bodies fit into a new post-war mass media system. The scientist lamented how modern life was, quote, becoming more and more a one-way communication from top and center down and out to the inert receivers. Its characteristic was one of the gaze, and the main instrumental culprit was television. He says, a passive solitary child gazing at the screen of a television receiver amuses only itself. The need to gaze does not promote or evoke habits of creativity or generosity. One-way mass media was degenerating our technologically expanded bodies into something that he saw was more like a spinal cord, able to receive instructions and implement reflex coordination than a brain. Television was dangerous, and so was cinema. Some of the dangers were immediate, and Walter wrote of cases where he found that when he went to the cinema, he would suddenly feel an irresistible urge to strangle the person next to him. An investigator in epilepsy described 2 patients who had difficulty on entering and leaving the cinema, and many others who passed out when kneeling close to the television screen or adjusting the set at close range. Other dangers lurked in the future, and Walter said, for Alice in Movieland, the future looks drab. Tom Sawyer will have few adventures at the television set. So strobe research did not fit with a widely held belief that our knowledge of the world is supposed to be built up only from the materials given by our sensory receptors. Scientists had long known of exceptions to this rule, illusions or hallucinations. But strobe visions were different. Interest in hallucinations was high in the 1950s and continued into the next decade. For example, in 1958, the American Psychiatric Association dedicated their yearly symposium to hallucinations, and investigations on LSD, mescaline, sensory deprivation, and schizophrenia dominated the conference, but strobe visions was notoriously absent. Why? The organizers of the conference claimed that there was, quote, clear agreement among clinicians on the nature of the phenomena included under the term hallucination. But strobe researchers did not agree. Smithies, the most important scientist working on them, held a completely different view of observation, reality, and hallucinations. Time and again, what fascinated Flicker researchers was how something could appear disconnected from the source of stimulation, but what was unique about strobe research was not merely its status as a form of hallucination. It revealed a long-standing debate about what counted as reality. Smithies believed that this was culturally conventional. So he said, thus it can be argued that the basic decision to call hallucinations real or unreal is a matter of convention and determined by the rules in our language relating to the word real, and is thus a matter of culture. And he went to analyze hallucinations of Eskimos and Indians and found out that they had different views about what a hallucination was. So let me conclude by by jumping to 1965. And by 1965, investigators still used the word byproduct to describe the strange effects of staring into a strobe light. Only a few artists continue to highlight these effects. In 1966, the experimental filmmaker Tony Conrad made the film The Flicker, where he exposed the audience to stroboscopic lights. And many left the movie theater disoriented, forgetting their bags, umbrellas, and other personal belongings. But what the audience underwent was described as experimental art by then, or as a countercultural experience. It wasn't as a form of scientific observation, as Smithies would have wanted. So I'll just conclude by saying that as flickering light proliferated, brightened, and became nearly all-pervasive, the controversial theorist Marshall McLuhan explained how all modern media could fit within two extremes. And one extreme was revealed by experiments in which all outer sensation is withdrawn, and the subject begins a furious fill-in or completion of the senses. The other extreme is characterized by what he called the hotting up of one sense. And both produced similar responses. He said, the hotting up of one sense tends to affect hypnosis, and the cooling of all senses tends to result in hallucination. McLuhan, nevertheless, decided not to focus on the extremes. Media was exactly what fell in the middle comfort zone. But I argue that it's these cases that reveal how, after the 1950s, observation was increasingly described as something that was mediated and that was studied in one node in a larger network of mass media communications. So I'll end with that. Thanks. Final image of William S. Burroughs looking at the dream machine that we have here.
Maybe we could just start with some questions and conversation. I had one to start with, perhaps. I find really interesting is the moment when the EEG is used as a way of not just sort of within the Peter Gallison, Lorraine Dustin frame of objectively describing what happens, but also the idea that then the machine, the instrument takes over as something that's representing the experience as a way detached from the person having to draw a picture from that experience. And it just reminds me of things like, Goethe had his whole, where he tries to take he calls the eye a scientific instrument. It's not something outside of the instrument isn't something that measures the body, but rather the eye itself can be a scientific base to make measurements, and you get into symmetries of what you see in colors and interference. And it just seems like then you did this for a while in the 50s, and then all of a sudden we come back with the EEG and we're separated once again from our instruments. And it's like suddenly we can just, the machine's making the records, we're just reading the graphs, the graph is telling us what happens, and then the mind somehow doesn't even need to be aware of, or the person doesn't need to be aware of themselves as a scientific instrument too. And so I don't know if you could...
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And one of the most amazing things is that I went to all the archives, all the sources to figure out every image that's been drawn of these strobe visions, and there are a handful. I showed you the ones that there are. There are just a few more, and this is something that ironically people say that we all see very frequently, that it happens when we're in a bicycle, when when you're driving a car or in a bus, you become all dreamy and start having souvenirs and memories, because the light flashes. Even experiences as putting on clothing and taking it off, the sort of change from light to dark and light to dark can evokes. And that there's just, it was really just from 1957 to 1958 that one weird scientist, John Smithies, went on a campaign to study these things as a scientific thing. And it's just a brief period that I think illuminates really, how we think about observation, because it's a contrasting, it's a counterexample of,
even in this, it's hard not to maybe, I think of this in terms of the objectivity of the book too, and then the evolution of trained judgment as being something that suddenly learns how to read the images in a different way, and the image isn't sort of providing the solutions, and maybe, like a little bit of Bergson, we had sort of talked about where it's not the experience, but it's the conditions of the experience, and that becomes the important thing. but it still seems like there's a sense of you're no longer drawing images, and I don't know. I mean, Ivana had asked us to also draw a little bit of what we were seeing, so there seems an element of bringing back in the body and as a set of experiences, and using those experiences as something that aren't just maybe interpretations or somehow, they're not just kind of,
Right, yeah.
but they could be, maybe they could capture something that the EEG doesn't, perhaps. And they could do this in a scientific way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things that they really sort of ran counter was that this idea, the Huxley and Jung, that whatever you were seeing had nothing to do with you. And that just runs so counter to how we think of observation. You think that what you're seeing has, is related to you, and the fact that people are seeing something that comes from elsewhere is very problematic. But I'd say a little bit more about objectivity, but we'll go to the
a couple
question.
of comments on the question. I mean, the one question is, it's quite obvious that in the background there is, shall we say, in the preconscious, there's text, let's say, we're dealing with things including the Manchurian candidate and, and with LSD being used at parties and people jumping out windows. And I was wondering whether you had thought, or anybody else had done any genealogical work on the relationship between that particular moment in history and the seer techniques that were developed by the military in order to program or deprogram people in order to resist torture, since of course involuntary exposure to all of this amounts to a kind of torture. That's one question. And so it's very highly relevant to,
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yes. Second of all, given that, at least according to Jean Lafranche, 90% of clinical hallucinations are auditory and not visual. Okay. Have you thought about doing any comparative work on the difference between the induction of hypnagogic or hallucination states by the voice or by sound as opposed to light? Because if I think about the theories of the central dominant cybernetic theory of schizophrenia in the 60s is of course Haley, Bates, and Lang. Right? Is the theory of the double bind, and the double bind involves verbal messages and gestural messages. So you can't say that it's strictly visual or that it's strictly oral or anything, but it certainly has to deal with linguistic and metalinguistic capacity. And then the other thing, just as a note, was I think that the first person to produce a film was, you mentioned one from 65, yes?
66, I think, Tony Conrad,
Flicker film. Peter Kudelka's Arnold Ryan, which is alternating sequences of black and white leader. Is earlier. But it's analog. And in a certain sense, there's a circumscribing question. So third question, but an important one, which is about the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative. What happens between the development of the optical telegraph by Lacanau in the 19th century, which is based on transmitting different lengths of signal, so in a certain sense is qualitative. And when the moment at which the alternations, either because of alternating currents in hertz or whatever, become regularized by an electronic process. That is to say, I can't imagine that there's that clear a cut between analog and digital. But I'm curious to know if you or anybody else has thought about that.
Yeah, great questions. And say a little bit about what I feel I can add to. Definitely, for the first one about soft torture techniques are the definite background of Richard Bloom's investigations, both of LSD and the strobe. And he comes, he's working at a classified unit from the Korean War. That is the definite background both to sensory deprivation chambers investigations, which kind of drop out of the literature very quickly after, in the late 1950s or the early 60s. It's sort of, you no longer can figure out what these experiments are doing. And it's the analog to strobe illumination. It was investigated how to produce hallucinations that were very unpleasant and that left no mark on the body. So it's a perfect soft torture technique, and that's the background. With respect to sound, that's very interesting, and I think somebody could write an analogous sort of story, figuring out the acoustic side to this, to the connection to schizophrenia. The stroboscope was compared to the tom-tom drum. So anything that, or torture techniques like the falling drop that can drive people crazy, and just repetitive rhythm as well as tickling was because it was sort of, it makes the body just go crazy. So but I don't know. I mean, I think it could be a very, very interesting history of, the sort of auditory technologies and the combination between the gramophone, because some of the early systems, like the Dream Machine, used the gramophone record, and some of the first scientists to look at stroboscope. I mean, or there's the disc. The proliferation of the disc to either black and white sectors or letting light pass or not is very frequently a record, a music record. So
there are experiments of people doing humming where they're just producing a certain frequency for a certain length of time, and how that actually starts to vibrate the vision, your eye, what you're seeing. So it's actually coordinating something between an audio and a visual. I don't remember who did those experiments. But.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing also in terms of the Jung-Huxley thing about, well, of course, if you deny the existence of the unconscious and you don't have to think consciously in your mind, naturally what's coming from the back of your mind doesn't have anything to do with you. So it's a self-fulfilling tautology. Right. But isn't it interesting that it was the analysts who at the same time were describing the auditory phenomena in terms of induction, and I'm thinking specifically of Theodore Wright, The Haunting Melody, and of Merton Gill, Hypnosis and Related States. Okay. Yeah. So the analysts were already, of course, concerned with the auditory.
And with trance music as well, because that's a bit of a connection to that I haven't explored with him.
But I'm just curious. I mean, couldn't you? I mean. If they could be analogous, but isn't there something, and this is maybe a naive question, but I think maybe it's okay, I guess. But it's with the light being changing from into electrical, into a chemical signal, I mean, is there something particular that's going on with light in terms of how the body is responding versus the sound waves in terms of how the body is responding?
You can change encephalograms by talking to people and inducing United States by speaking to them, or by music, or by, innumerable numbers of ways.
No, but I mean, in terms of the light, right, but the light waves, is the light wave going to be transformed physiologically by the body in a different, in a way that maybe adds a step, has another step to it than it's happening sort of auditorily, sound waves into chemical signals.
Well, what was the year of Wald discovering rods and cones of rhodopsin? It was around that time.
No. Okay, and let's see. Oh, and then your comment about Peter Kudelka. Yes, well, I think thanks for that. And there are many. Some of the earlier movies, for some reason, they use strobe effects they don't do it self-consciously, but there are just a number of movies where the first leader scenes is, walking under a tree, and I think it's part of the movie experience to go and see these changes in it. So, but again, I mean, that's another sort of history that could be done to in film theory, go into and seeing how black and white alternations of black and white are used to create a certain effect. Yeah, so I don't know if I covered what I could. Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Does every light source you plug into mains flicker?
Yes, yeah. Every light bulb, every fluorescent light, the frequency is such that we don't notice it. But
could you maybe talk about this relationship between succession of images like a film and then something maybe around like a Bergsonian idea of these something that's not working by sort of in a film way in terms of the body?
Yes, I mean that I find. I mean, when I sort of moved my projects from doing this focusing on the 19th century, which is what I've always done, and then doing an experiment and going to the 20th century and try to see it in similar eyes. I think sometimes I caricaturize the sort of the beat poets and but I think it highlights certain things. But one of the most amazing things was really the change in the analogy of observation as being televisual and no longer a cinematographic camera. So the critique of Bergson, which is a 19th century critique and very powerful one, was connected to certain technologies that around his time. And in the 1950s, the changes in how we think, scientists started thinking about observation had their analogous technology, and it's not a coincidence that it was the same factory, Scofoni, who did television sets and did the strobe light, because it's basically the same thing. You need complex electronics, then you need glasswork, and you need gases, chemical gases. So radar, television, and strobe, along with the electronics that have to do with radio, have the same overall materials. And the big change in philosophy, I think, is this question that now we're used to it, but that we think of observation as something that's mediated. And I mean, one of the riskier claims that I'm making in this paper is that really that started around the 1950s with this research, and that we didn't think of observation as media before then.
So I guess the main point, the observation is mediated by what, or is it an analogy?
Well,
related to the word media, or mediated by the
both. So that people start using the word that observation is mediated, that it's not just a direct mimetic reflection of the outside world, as a camera obscura analogy would lead you to believe, but that it's really part of a network, a node of various media systems, and I think that. Well, for example, I mean, for example, going back to the sources. So Smithies was fighting a view of observation which he called was the naive realist view, and that, in a sense, was what informed the early Edgerton photographs, where the way of interpreting them was that this was just a literal transcription of the world, a universal language. And because of the research in strobe and because of the hallucinations that he noticed when looking at a strobe light, he thought that this way of looking at observation, it was just too simple, that it's not just that the world's out there and that you're separated from it and that you see it, but rather, like television, there's a lot of, it's mediated, there's a lot of intermediary stages, and that the message itself is changed changes according to the media, whatever is the container of the information. And that's the type of language that they started using after the 1950s to describe perception fits more with this type of philosophy of but I mean that's one of it's a bit of a bold and risky claim that I'm doing, but I'm kind of prepared to make the claim that thinking of observation as mediated and not just as direct is really connected to a certain not only strobe but illumination technologies that appeared in the later part of the 20th century. Yeah.
Well, what about these cases of epilepsy created by manga cartoons, like Japanese manga cartoons? Is something related with this?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
yeah. There was an incident not too long ago where all these kids, I don't know if you've heard that, all these kids many kids went into a catatonic stage and because of the strobe.
And also this kind of American TV advertisement now, this is kind of like all these images together, all these sounds, all these flashes, is kind of to take you or get you in the sofa, just like to absorb this kind of information and just stay there, or is not related with.
Well, I think it has to be in some way. I mean, the fact that these that the strobe is seen as addictive, that it's hard to stop seeing. I'm sure is
This was another question. Is that a fact that can be addictive?
Well, yes, the scientists think that it is addictive to do this these things. I don't know if Ivan is already addicted, or if we have any addicts in the room yet. But I don't know. Yeah.
Can I just make one comment?
Yeah,
it's
sure.
not just any intensity of light that can create this effect. It's a particular frequency and a particular luminance, so there is a threshold. So when they do it scientifically, you have to find that threshold. So anything less or more is not going to create. And the manga, the Japanese animation, what happened was that luminance, because of the intensity of rotation of a number of colors, that luminance was actually created that is normally not happening on your TV. So it's not that anything that you see and is moving fast is going to create a flicker effect. There is a certain level of luminance required.
I mean, that sort of seems it gets really interesting as a part of just an effect that's happening or just an experience that you can have, whether it's a dream machine and you start to really understand the conditions by which those experiences happen, and then you can start to either scientifically, then you can tune the instrument to make it match and produce certain things within the body. You can understand a range of effects that are possible. I mean, this is the way, at least it seems like, we talked about this a little bit, but let's say landscape designers might work within an ecology of a system. They try to understand a series of pressures, compressions and tensions and constraints, and pressures that sort of all are sort of in this, are tuned within this. And maybe this is the cybernetics part, where you have these sort of interrelationships, as sort of a collective series of interrelationships, which you manipulate the variables of, and then the hibernate, the steersman actually is the person that's moving the ship through the forces to be able to direct it towards certain sort of shores of possibility. I mean, it seems like if you're having this as an effect, you could treat this as just something that's happening, and it could be interesting. But then once you start to question, why it's interesting, and then you start to manipulate what you can do with why it's interesting or what its possibilities are, not only gives you control, but it also it makes it either useful scientifically, or within a laboratory it makes it useful commercially, or it makes it within that sort of military laboratory establishment that you're getting at MIT, which is also a weird thing in the 60s, of course. But there was you said another thing too I thought was really interesting, where that moment where with the epilepsy, it was traced from happening to a certain set of individuals to sort of everyone having this sort of capability. And could you say a little bit more about that, in a sense of suddenly we all become conscious of a set of possibilities rather than something that
Than that, yeah.
uniquely is prescribed to this person. But we still have this within, a pathologist would say, well, you still got sickle cell anemia that can happen within a certain kind of a population. This maybe is due to diet or something. But then you start to still isolate some condition that's particular to that group, whereas this seems more universal in a way.
Yes, I think, I don't know too much about it from the history of epilepsy, but one of the big, hallmark moments of change in research is precisely around this period with this research where epilepsy was no longer seen as something that, okay, you are either an epileptic or not, but that it's a sort of latency and something that can be triggered and can be changed. And apparently, from what I know, was a big revolution in medicine. But yeah, I don't know too much more about it. Yeah.
How is the percentage of normal individuals who experience epilepsy after this kind of especially
Yeah.
thousands of people that in this experience also
Yeah.
epilepsy. And also the other question, is there some data how many of these persons have experienced true hallucinations? Because these, what probably most of us have experienced here, are not probably true hallucinations. They're just funny reactions of these stimuli, which are frequency and intensity.
Well, apparently, yeah.
That's the question.
But apparently, you need to practice. So the dream machine was something that you would get better at by using frequently. So then you could go into a hallucination quicker.
Sorry,
yeah.
what do you mean, to choose what you want to see somehow? Or
No, just to get the effect. So a lot of the people describe it that it takes practice. Yeah, to get the visions.
Majority of people have some sort of patterns.
Yes.
And a
Yeah.
small minority actually see stuff.
But that's one. That was one of the scientists. The other scientists would claim that wasn't true. In fact, that researcher was the same research that claimed that it was schizophrenics that saw the most meaningful images. So,
Could you say you have to be? That's two kinds of being conscious of the experiment in a way. You're conscious of what happens to you. Then you're conscious of the conditions by which you control that. The turning up the speed, turning up the frequency. I'm thinking of your comment with the frequency of how you explained this phenomenon with the game.
That was luminance, but yeah.
Right, but just the idea that if you're conscious of the conditions of the experiment,
you could perhaps
manipulate it and practice it, and then you could start to say, I want this to happen. Or I want.
Yeah, the documents I read sort of they underline the practice, but as to the numbers, I don't know. Huxley had this thing like a throwaway sentence after he described how amazing it was to look into a strobe light, that he said like I think it's 1 in 60. He said one case in 60 can turn out badly. I don't know what he meant by badly, but 60, that's a sort of low number.
It's very interesting to distinguish between the reaction you have during the light you see and the reaction which remains after you experience it. So it's both. For epilepsy, it's completely different to hallucination, but that's what you see here. It's not hallucination because it doesn't remain when the stimuli is gone.
Gone.
That's what I think.
May I share a comment?
Yeah, sure.
So there is, in this field of research, one of the issues is pretty much whether one could call these patterns hallucinations or whether you should simply call them phosphenes. And one of the reasons that they say what could be the distinction between them is which part of the visual cortex basically are affected. If it's just early visual areas, then what you're going to have is going to be simple patterns and geometrical shapes. If it's a bit higher, then you'll experience colors, and it's a little bit higher, you might experience faces. So because different individuals are reporting different things, it's very difficult to say whether we could call it hallucination in the sense of, did you see a face, did you see a car, did you see a boat, which are higher in terms of visual response, or did you just see some patches of colors or some patches of funny triangles following some circles, etc. So what you're mentioning is correct, that there is a controversy of whether to call this hallucinations or phosphines, but nonetheless there are evidence to both ways. So,
Can I ask both of you, how are you correctly in different cultures if you interview people from really different backgrounds, the answers are different. Could you both relate to this, what this could mean or what the results were?
Yeah. I mean, that's another of the really revolutionary comments by Smithy, or radical comments of Smithy, was that the decision to call something a hallucination is culturally determined or conventional. So he would deny that we have a scientific test for this is a hallucination or this isn't a hallucination, because he did this anthropological work with Eskimos and Plain Indians, where he thought he didn't think that for example, certain hallucinations could be meaningful for other cultures, so priests, and they could be omens, and they weren't considered then as hallucinations. They were considered as messages or meaningful in some way. He didn't think that there were cultures that actually thought that they were seeing, the hallucination, that it was, and that I think, I mean, it's a pretty sort of radical comment, and I think there's some philosophers and historians of hallucinations that their eureka moment is that, like, okay, well, these things are culturally determined in a sense, and it's just amazing to see that it was also sort of a 1950s point by the scientists too.
So early or so late?
That it's so early, yeah.
But the philosophers were saying that since Hegel.
Sorry?
I mean,
Oh yes, well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another thing I thought, or what I know about it, it's like hallucinations can be totally independent from any external stimulation. So therefore, I mean, this is somehow related to an external stimulation. It can happen without light. So an hallucination which appears without external stimulation is totally different from what we experience.
Sure, yeah.
not entirely, because it's very good that you asked these questions, because it relates to what I'm going to talk to you about, so I'm happy about that. So what I'll try to show you is that what happens what this flicker basically triggers is not necessarily what you see in the end, but it's basically cutting certain connections temporarily. So it's both which areas will be affected by this the pulses that you're receiving, so which areas will be activated. But another issue is that the connection of the retinal input, what you actually are receiving on the retina, and the sort of the amount of activity that was supposed to be different depending on what comes to your retina, is now this connection is disconnected, meaning whatever there is high activity there. So it's a mode of temporary blindness in a way. That's why there's this 2008 paper that I'll show some of its results. That's why these researchers say we could call this hallucination, because in effect it's not necessarily what there is on your retina that is determining what you're experiencing visually. And it's like a sort of a temporary blindness. So there is this disconnection from what there is in the external world. There is something in the external world that triggers this disconnection, but there is a temporary disconnection, and that is when the hallucination happens. Or if you want to call it phosphenes, or let's just say mental experience, visual experience. But
I have a short question, and maybe we could expand this temporary blindness to a constant blindness, that you never have access to the real of vision. You deal always with second images. This thing you said in the hallucinations described by the patients afterwards had nothing to do with what they were seeing. Of course, they have never to do anything what we see or what we describe that what we see, actually see, so that we don't have access to that. So it's not temporary, but it's and perpetuated temporary blindness.
But also most contemporary theories of perception would agree that what you see is not a completely an effect of what is on the retina, because and So this is somehow also the question. If you have an instrument, how you use this. If you have a light microscope, then it's pretty obvious. You look through it and you see the world. But what if you have an electronic microscope which you build with the algorithms, and then is this still the world? And if I get it right, this is also the direction the stroboscope as a machine goes. Like you observe something, you have these pictures, but it's just completely constructed, artificial. But it's the same. You don't have the layer between, let's say, outside and inside, which can be the complete basis of the image you experience. So it's not even a retina, and you could go behind the retina. Where is the layer where you say what is on this layer is the image you see? It doesn't really exist this layer. So yes, you cannot construct. You cannot say that the thing you see is just the product of what was on your retina. There is some interpretation, some processing, some other modalities of experience you had, your conceptual network, all where it all kicks in.
That's true, but there is what I meant was not that in normal vision, whatever is in the retina directly translates to the cortex, but what I meant was that the kind of interaction that happens is completely different. So there is something which is, there's tonic neural activity that happens when you want to transfer, when basically what is transferred, what is on the retina gets transferred through the lateral geniculate nucleus to the back of the head, to the visual cortex. And they say that what happens when this temporary disconnectedness happens is that this turns into bursts, meaning before, let's say, if I saw blue, there was this amount of activity, and that amount of activity was observed in the cortex. If I saw something very bright, there was higher activity. So there was a sort of comparison of what there is on the retina and what there is activity in the cortex. But in case of bursts, you just have everything at the same time goes woof, so it reacts completely the same to any kind of input that you're getting. And that is so it's not that I was claiming in normal vision, in normal vision, everything is direct. It's just that I was saying, regardless of
Okay. I mean, it also seems really dangerous to take that seriously, total blindness, or to. I mean, I completely. I mean, this goes all the way back in philosophy. Sort of perception is an act of activity. It's a making. It's not something passively that's happened. It's something that participating in sort of is a part of that. What you're seeing. I mean, you're not outside of that system, but it seems that to say this like total blindness, and again, I don't know if this is fair in terms of maybe it's too materialist, but to say total blindness would imply that there's something out there real that's not accessible to us. And I'm thinking of like, this was an argument, it seems like, in hacking, with electrons. If you can spray them, they are real. I mean, it was the manipulability of the conditions of the world that allow you to sort of say, we might perceive that world differently, and because we're either physiologically constructing it as well as we perceive it, it's not something passive. But at the same time, it's to say that there's a total blindness as if there's a real thing out there that we're not, that somehow we can't get to or we can't attain. I mean, this sounds dangerously Hegelian to me, that there's some kind of something outside of a system that we can maybe point all of our, if we could really see, then as if the really seeing that we're doing isn't somehow the real seeing too.
But Hegel says precisely that experience is mediated, that we're not.
But he doesn't use the word mediated.
But I mean, what does total blindness count for in terms of something like the experience of somebody who both sleeps and dreams?
I don't know who's a total blindness. I said temporary blindness.
Okay, temporary blindness.
But that's not mine.
But I mean, I know people who sleep and dream with their eyes open. So how does that, and so there's a question there, because obviously your sensorium is in a certain sense open, and yet it's closed. What does that do?
But when is it not always some state of both of those things? I'm just saying that to somehow say that there's something real that is outside of our being here, or some set of real seeing, one talks about it in a metaphorical sense, and the other one talks about it within a physiological sense. And it seems like the one we could speculate on, I don't mean this in a sort of degrading way, because I actually love this way too, this in a poetic manner. That's saying the poetics is a negative thing, but rather to talk about this as a state of, I mean, that golf ball to the atomic bomb seems dramatic in the sense that it's also understanding a new possibility of the technology and of the perceiving and of the seeing that's changing not only sort of what we understand is happening in an objective sense. The ball is deforming, so we can study deformation in a different way because of the exchange of the bat or the golf ball. I mean, one of the reasons I think this was shown was because there was an argument whether or not the golf ball was really turning from a sphere into something that deformed. And so you could get into material science and that way. But this is a whole scale of material science is just as real. And somehow to say these things are completely similar in that way too, but to say somehow that there's a real seeing out there that's that's outside of this, or blindness seems to really get into a muddy, I'm not real, what I'm seeing isn't real, what you're not seeing isn't real.
I mean, I think, I mean, the interesting is to do some work in which, sort of in this case, very simple theory of observation. There's nothing complicated. That's how the world is. You have the bullet, you have the apple. We take the photograph, and that's reality. There's not a view in which the camera itself is changing the way that we look at things. It's just about discovery, and on the other hand, then you have alternative sciences. So, for example, for Killian, who was working with Eisenhower, and a very sort of establishment person, he didn't want to get into the complications about perception. Yet there were other scientists that had the view of observation was more complicated, and that analogized it to the technology that they were working with, like television, and used a different type of started using a vocabulary that has since become very, very common, which is basically that observation, that perception is mediated. So there are all these positions at work at the same time, with different interests, different politics, and different sources. Different, the people are situated in different contexts, and are invested in certain views about how we should think about reality and observation. So I think, with that, I would be, if we can figure that out, then I'm satisfied with having a few threads to the story, rather than to figuring out the metaphysical problem. But to just tell the story of how certain people adopt certain of these theories for particular reasons and in a certain context, and not others. Yeah.
I think that one implicit interest in these experiments was to have the simplest possible thing you could see, flashing light, and then that would be the possibility to have any research and observation where it doesn't get too complicated, not too many semantics, not too much symbols, not too much conventions coming in, just light flashing. So it's simple enough to say what you see is what you experience, what you see is what you see actually. Is it one light on?
Well, yeah.
You see a single photo. So.
They didn't start the experiments with that in mind. This was sort of these were like byproducts that appeared to scientists. Nobody really said, let's investigate vision in its simplest formulation. But the irony is that even if you think about it, then you have the sort of the complexity of what really happens when you have white light, and you have white light stimulation, and people see things that are not present in the stimulus, and that itself was very, I think, continues to be very, very enigmatic. Yeah.
Just one thing, maybe in agreement with you and in answer to Christina's question, is that about the different cultural notions of hallucination. You can see science as a culture. Every culture has its own means of protecting its own cultural products, and science is another culture, and it protects its own cultural products. Its means of protection is experiments, logic, etc. I don't know, political hierarchies in science, etc. So the same way, so I wouldn't think that if someone comes and says, hey, look, hallucination is a cultural factor, it's not necessarily identifiable in one way or another, I think science would agree with that and say, and here is mine. So I agree with Jimena also, that although it might sound radical to say this, but I do think that the explanation of hallucinations in science is just one of the many, and it has its own methods. People who have these methods appeal to them, they can take these ones, but the Eskimo can take his own. So.